Okay, thank you, Sam, and thanks to the Photographers Gallery for hosting this event this evening. I'm also going to be really brief. It's nothing really to do with me, this event, other than arranging things. And the arrangement was in the context of a day in this room where we gathered together researchers as part of the Centre for the Networked Image, which is based at London South Bank University, and we were discussing current research ideas, sharing comments and thoughts about various things, including diagramming. And that kind of leads us into this evening's event, where we've invited 3 members of the diagramming research group who are without John Cussans. John Cussans is actually on a desert island, which we, all wish we were with him, of course. But the 3 members of the group that are here this evening, names are on the screen: Mary Yacoob, Dean Kenning, and David Burrows. They're going to present some of the ideas behind a forthcoming book, which will be published by Bloomsbury early next year. And we're, like many of you, really excited about the publication of this book. It resonates with lots of ideas that we're working with in our research centre, for instance. And we also really like the awkwardness of doing this at the Photographers Gallery. I mean, what's this got to do with photography? But maybe that's to be discovered. Perhaps nothing. So with that, I'll just pass on to all of you. And David, you seem to be first on the list.
So thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the Photographers Gallery for hosting us. On your chairs, not all of you will have found a flyer, I'm afraid, but those of you who did or do have in your hand a flyer with the image of the book, there is a code, and that code gets you 35% off the hardback book. Now, we were trying to work out what that was, so it's nothing to do with us, but the book is going to be about £80. But with the discount, it's just over £40. So, but the caveat there is just to say that we also are going to have the book available through open access. However, Bloomsbury would really love it if you had this lovely hardback book in your hand. It's nothing like a real book. So anyway, the piece of paper and the pencil, what that's for, will become apparent as we go on. And I think also just thank you for coming. It's many more people than I thought would come. There are some familiar faces, which makes me slightly nervous. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. So our diagram research group, it emerged out of regular meetings, which was initiated by Dean and Mary, to which John Cussans and myself were invited. And the meetings first took place over the COVID lockdowns. It was a time of Zoom and a lot of disruption for all of us. And we've continued them to the present day. And we meet with no purpose other than to talk about our interest in diagrams. And our collaboration is through conversation, and it's something we think is important, and we hope our book captures this. So the DRG, as we call it, is something like a college, C-O-L-L-E-G-E, of diagramming, which doesn't actually exist in our own universities and the art schools that we work in, or doesn't exist yet. And, maybe that's strange because diagramming is found in most university disciplines. It's found in art, everyday life, everyday labour. Mary's going to talk about art and science in a bit and our interest in diagrams. And we've laid out pieces of paper and a pencil. So we would like you to engage in a bit of participation if you've got pencil and paper. You can make notes and do what you want, but we'd be really interested for you to diagram what you think the relationship of art and science is as we talk. If you might fade in and out as we go on. But you can draw any other diagram that interests you, and we'd ask to keep them at the end of the session, but also maybe someone will wave one at the end and will, be a basis for discussion. The pencils, they are great from the photographer's gallery, but wouldn't be my chosen way of drawing. So don't feel you have to use the pencil. You can use your favourite pen if you've got one. So, there's some clipboards if you would like, if you need them. So, our first substantial project together was a residency at a space called Flat Time House, where we drew on the archives of an artist who liked to diagram called John Latham. And we made 4 broadcasts, which were later hosted on an interactive website, which might still be available. And the broadcasts were very much like our meetings. And that image on the screen is really, how we do things. We just went on Zoom and talked and showed diagrams. Our book is really our second substantial project together. We have some history. Dean, John and I had previously worked together with others as the Diagram, Research, Use and Generation Group, or DRUG, with Amy Clark, who's actually featured in the book, Andrew Conio, who was here but has now gone off to some other thing, and David Osbaldeston, all of us artists. And Mary also took part in drug-related events, including a memorable day of drawing and diagramming at Westfield shopping centre, which actually defeated us all because we couldn't work out how to diagram Westfield. So under the more current sober name, DRG, Mary, Dean, John and I, sometimes with others, Claire, who's here, explore the generation and use of diagrams. And we explore diagrams as a means of presenting, we think often, what is invisible, what is ideological, what's uncounted, what's speculative, what's intensive or yet to come. Mostly things that are not easy to represent. And maybe that's obvious to say that about the function of diagrams. And we've spent a long time talking about what can be counted as a diagram. And after a lot of arguing, sometimes very heated discussion, I think we've all come to the view that there is no definitive phrase that sums up what a diagram is. So our book does not do this. We have come to the view, or we accept that diagramming is an expanded practice. However, we have found and focused on the fact that many diagrams are analogical or use analogy, or they function through analogy, which Dean is going to talk about. So that's one focus, and that's a key focus of our book. And we also often come back to a statement by C.S. Peirce, the philosopher and semiotician, who said that diagrams are icons of intelligible relations. So in presentations of relations and analogy in art, sciences and social sciences are the focus of our book. One other definition, which is on the screen, I'm not going to read it out, has been very useful for us though. Suzanne Lieb suggests that there are at least currently two kinds of diagrams that people are interested in. The first kind, diagrams are systematizations, and as a means of ordering what exists, or I guess what may exist, but systematization is the key word there. And the second kind is diagrams as projective vectors orientated towards the unknown. Perhaps for people who really know their diagrams, that's not a kind of surprise. We've been interested in the former type of diagram, often as an aspect of pedagogical, critical problem-solving practices, and we are teachers in art schools, so diagrams are very important to us in that respect. We use them in our teaching practice sometimes. And the latter as generative practice, or we're interested in the latter kind for our own practices, because they can generate new worlds and new formations. So the last thing I'm going to say at this point is to say that the key to a diagram, to what the parts of a diagram point to, and the words that articulate a diagram are very important. often crucial. And we have long discussions, though. We're still not sure whether it's only humans that diagram. We had a long discussion about whether bees, when they dance, a figure of 8, are they diagramming? And we've had to accept that one person's diagram is not a diagram for everyone, and that contingencies and contexts are important. But as artists, particularly working in a university where there's so many diagrams just taken as ready-mades, we're aware of diagrams as figures and inscriptions, gestures, fictions, intensive and effective performances. Perhaps we see this in ways that others do not. We attend to the formal processes, mediations and material instantiations of diagrams, and that's a key part of our book. And we think that Gilles Châtelet was right to suggest that diagrams are gestures that invite other gestures. And he also wrote, quoting Schelling, that thought is not always encapsulated within the brain, that it could be everywhere, outside, in the morning dew. And we could say then that thought is in diagrams. Diagrams don't just articulate thoughts or present images, they generate them. And that's something we take into our own practice and is a key for our discussions, I think. So I'm going to hand over to Dean, if that's okay, Dean.
Okay. That's not. Oh, it's not hard about it. Hello. Okay. Right. I'm going to just remain seated, if that's okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. So, So the book is called Drawing Analogies, partly or maybe initially because it's from a series called Drawing In, and we didn't think it would be very interesting to have a book called Drawing Diagrams. So we called it Drawing Analogies. There's good reasons for that. And of course, Drawing Analogies is an analogy itself and a sort of a joke. So I'll start with one of the key sort of figures and theorists of diagrams for us, Peirce, who David mentioned. So Peirce writes, deduction consists in constructing an icon or diagram, the relation of whose parts shall present a complete analogy with those of the parts of the object of reasoning, of experimenting upon this image in the imagination, and of observing the results so as to discover unnoticed and hidden relations among the parts. So there's a couple of things there. This question of experimentation, which is very important to Peirce and to us, the fact that the diagram is an active thing, and diagramming is an active experimentation. A very cheap experimentation you can do. You don't need, all you need is a pencil and paper to do it, and you can experiment upon the objects. The important part of that quote is that a diagram is a type of icon, but it's an icon where the relations of the parts shall present a complete analogy with those of the parts of the object. So this is about parts and relations. Now, for Peirce, everything comes in threes. And a sign can either be an icon which is defined in terms of resemblance, an index which is defined in terms of an existential relation to the object it's representing, or a symbol which is defined in terms of convention. And the icon itself is then split into three. There's an image which resembles in terms of its qualities. A diagram, so diagram is absolutely fundamental to the whole semiology of Peirce, which is defined, as I said, in terms of the relations of the parts of the thing you're diagramming, and a metaphor, which is defined in terms of a third thing, which brings two other unrelated things together. Now, an icon is whatever form it takes, whatever one of these three forms it takes, is a resemblance. It is an analogy, but these analogies operate differently. So we've decided that there are three types of analogy. And many other people talk about the first two. So one way I thought that I could maybe illustrate this is to think of like a cloud as fluffy and a bit like a bit of cotton wool. And if I actually took a bit of cotton wool and stuck it on a piece of blue paper, that would almost be enough to recognize something in a certain likeness. So there's a resemblance there. There's an analogy there already. Now, I was thinking it's quite funny to describe a cloud as fluffy because a cloud is made of water, and there's something completely unfluffy about water, and therefore a cloud. So a diagram might either have to go in at a level beyond perception, basically. Would either go sort of at a micro level and go down to the water molecules and so on to figure out how this thing works, or we might go to a macro scale, talk about seas and rivers and winds and other sort of dynamic things. So that would constitute the way a cloud consists of a system of parts which are related in particular ways. So this is what we're calling a structural definition of diagram. Lots of different people say roughly the same thing about these two types of two forms of analogy. So Hofstadter, who's written a lot about analogy, for example, again talks about analogy as being absolutely key to learning, to the way we think, to development, to scientific breakthroughs, and so on. And one example he gives is very small child, 1-year-old or something, and they see the Hoover and they want to press the button. They think that if they press the button, something might happen because they've got a toy and their toy, they press the button and something happened. It's quite disappointing if they press the button and it's not plugged in and nothing happens. But you then move on to a more sort of structural level. Now, this all really goes back to Aristotle, like a lot of these things, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in my chapter. But Aristotle defined these two types of analogy as well, or they were later called in medieval scholastic philosophy, an analogy of proportion, an analogy of proportionality. Proportion would be where there is some sort of way in which two different things do actually link together. There's a focal meaning, as Aristotle would say. The other more structural way of thinking about analogy is basically A is to B as C is to D. You say like gills are to fish as lungs are to mammals, for example. So this is a bit more abstract. There's a sort of leap. Deleuze and Guattari talk about the difference between these two things as, on the one hand, the sort of perceptual analogy, the first order analogy is the similarities which differ. And the more structural level would be differences that resemble. So it's a more sort of abstract level. Of course, you can also then become quite poetic, or you can institute sort of hierarchies within that. So like sight is to the eyes as reason is to the soul or something. So we then think about insight, for example, the sight of or mental blindness or something like this. Now, I think and this is really one of the things I try to work out in the chapter, is that there is actually a third type of analogy which Deleuze describes, particularly when he writes his book on Francis Bacon. And this is what he calls aesthetic analogy, what I'm calling nervous analogy. And this would be a form which he calls resemblance by non-resemblant means. And this is still an analogy. There is still a correlation between one set of relations and another set of relations, except that these two sets of relations don't resemble each other. There's no resemblance, but there's correlation without resemblance, or there's resemblance by non-resembling means. I'll go into this a little bit more, but it's a sort of dislike of that way in which analogy is, or it still comes down to a question of representation between what is alike and what is not alike, and how you can sort of make leaps between things that are unalike, but still the sort of relation between these two things might be used to describe the relation between two other things, which in an object which we're less familiar with. So this is a sort of becoming, I suppose, where things are connected on a common plane rather than being connected through the faculty of reason. I hope that makes some sort of sense. I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about that when I come to describing the chapters. And I'll hand over to Mary to talk about diagrams and art and science.
Yeah. Right. So much of what I'm going to say is based on our collectively written introduction. So in our introduction, we talk about how, like many artists, we self-learn about different disciplines, and we kind of walk amongst different disciplines in a kind of peripatetic kind of way. So in this book, we write about art, but with a view to interconnections with, for example, semiotics, psychoanalysis, that would be John's chapter, anthropology, physics, that's David's chapter, philosophy, cognitive science, spirituality, that would be me a bit, cosmology, and the transdisciplinary and hybrid nature of diagrams. These diagrams are used in all these disciplines, including arts, has energized artists. The diagrammatic art is one creative means to relate to or to be inspired by different fields of research. So artists appropriate knowledge, methods, ideas, images from science, but are not subject to those disciplinary constraints of those subjects. And there can be creative mistranslations or speculations or imaginings when artists walk around these different disciplines. And that's what we have done, I think. So this approach might be influenced by arts education. So we say that many arts institutions from the 1960s onwards were starting to introduce different disciplines such as philosophy, critical theory, psychoanalysis, sociology, and cybernetics, as well as influences from pop culture and subcultures. So art in education itself was starting to bring in all these different disciplines. And so to recap what David was saying, Suzanne Leaves has been quite influence on us in that she says there are two main types of diagrams that she distinguishes. Those are aids to systemization and those that are more open constellations. The systemizing ones might be more that visualize classification structures or statistical data or operational sequences so that we can order complex information into manageable forms. And then the open diagrams might be more aesthetic, ambiguous, exploratory, speculative, and non-instrumental. And so we say that it might be tempting to allocate the systemizing diagrams to science and the kind of arty, ambiguous, aesthetic ones to arts. But we say that it's more interesting to consider that there are systematic and open aspects to diagrams across disciplines and across individual practices. It could be people working the same discipline have a different, they might have similar methodologies, but they might take a more open or a more systematic approach in individual diagrams in their practice. But one thing we talk about is also how, there may be differences in how people use diagrams. And perhaps artists are maybe more likely to be non-instrumental in how they use diagrams. They don't necessarily have to maximize efficiency or function or usefulness. They don't necessarily, they're not necessarily tied to showing how something works or showing a mathematical proof. So this thing of instrumental use of diagrams is something we're interested in, or not using in diagrams necessarily in an instrumental way. And that could be because sometimes maybe when less instrumental, it could be that maybe we're open to possibilities for diagrams that might get overlooked, alternative ways of using diagrams, maybe harnessing the logic or functional materialities of diagrams for different purposes. And for example, we might concentrate on how a line or tone or gestural marks or colour themselves might carry meaning in a diagram independent to or alongside of the actual content that it's diagramming. So to go on from that, so as artists, we draw attention to the act of making diagrams. How do we compose diagrams? So not thinking about, say, feeding data into these computer models that then spit out a diagrams that's already been formatted for you, but actually sitting down and designing a diagram from scratch. And even if you're, the practice of making a diagram, even if it's a computerized one, just that practice of making and composing might have an openness. So bringing in that kind of idea from Suzanne Ede again, the openness, potential openness of diagrams, in that even if it's a computerized one, you still have to make decisions about color or scale or font that might affect how people find meaning in your diagram. So the process of making might reveal unforeseen options or elements or connections. Likewise, in the arts, perhaps influenced by post-structuralist theory, there's been a focus on how we interpret artworks. So the artworks are not artworks are received and interpreted. And so in the interpretation of artwork, we might contribute to an artwork's meaning and kind of complete the artwork as we are looking at it and interpreting it and engaging with it. And so that's an aspect of reading diagrams that we then take forward, from art practice and into how we relate to diagrams. And we also talk about the dialectics of the aesthetics of diagrams. So how do we understand the aesthetics of diagrams? So diagrams might be received as formal, material, affective, sensory objects, and these properties might be harnessed by different disciplines outside of art practice. For example, scientists might engage with the aesthetics of the diagram in order to communicate a complicated message. On the other hand, we talk about a diagrammatic turn in earlier 20th century art that marks a time when artists were going beyond the formal and aesthetic and attributes of an artwork. So here we have an example of Marcel Duchamp, the large glass, in which one interpretation of the artwork is that he's reimagining human desire as a mechanical diagram. And by using diagrams, Duchamp is making an ideas-driven work, a conceptual work, that challenged traditions about art and beauty. And then the art historian Martin Kemp, who writes about art and science, he's an expert on Leonardo da Vinci, and he writes about commonalities between the arts and sciences. He writes that he's less interested on the influence of art on science or the influence of art, or vice versa, how one influenced the other. He's more interested in how there are shared aesthetic instincts across the arts and sciences. And he writes that there are shared structural intuitions in both the arts and sciences. That is, shared intuitions about structure, about order and disorder, and an interest in mental structures and patterns of organization, both static and moving, in the natural and technological world. And then going on from there, there was a kind of influence in the 1960s across the arts of cybernetics and systems theory and information theory from the 1960s onwards, and this maybe had an influence on the use that artists were making of systems, grids, classification, and mathematical systems, and artworks that forefront processes. So rather than thinking about the art object as a kind of static object, rather they're kind of bringing an aesthetic value into systems, how things are related to one another. And that's a kind of where we get kind of like maybe diagrammatic artworks coming into play. So whereas modernists were more interested in the autonomous art object, postmodernists were more interested in relational or non-autonomous objects, systems and relationships. So this is where diagrams become really useful. And here we can also think about the artwork of Stephen Willett. So his diagrammatic artworks in which he asks, for example, people to document in text and photos their living environments and social interactions. So his sociology is an influence in his artworks. And then he kind of composes this information that he collects from people, say, living on a housing estate, into these diagrammatic artworks. And often there's kind of loads of these panels. And so it's not like you're reading one of those images, you're reading each of those images in relation to all the other ones, in relation to all the other panels. So you're kind of walking around them. And then Here's Mary Kelly. So this is an artwork where she's influenced by psychoanalysis, Jack Lacan, and she's also influenced by feminism. And in this artwork, she is observing the behavior of her young son, toddler, and his development of his sense of self and language. And I can't remember her exact, she had a very particular system, like maybe in one column she's observing what he says, in the other column it's maybe her observations, her immediate observations about what he said, and in a third column maybe it's a week later, what's her memory of this whole thing. So these different stages. And then again, maybe we talk in the discussion, is this a diagram or not? Or is it more that the concept of diagrams is useful in interpreting this artwork? And then you can say the same about Hannah Dovoven. She adopts calendars and mathematical sequences. She's also influenced by music. So you can imagine this connection between music and mathematics. And I would say her artworks are diagrammatic but cryptic. So again, there's kind of like really strange connection. You think of diagrams being clear, but I think her works are a little bit cryptic. They again include groups of drawings set out in grids across multiple walls. So the meaning isn't just conveyed in the lone artwork, but rather in how they work together and how they're kind of, again, kind of like expressive of a nervous system. That's kind of me being influenced by Dean's work. Like maybe this kind of like repeated marks that she's making, this kind of asemic writing, kind of handwriting that's not familiar, handwriting that may be very particular to her. It's a kind of like recording her consciousness or recording, it's a kind of consciousness recording its activities. So that's kind of brief talk about art and science, kind of lifting off sections from our introduction. And now I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about one of my chapters. So just to say, I did 2 chapters. One of my chapters, which I'm not really talking about today, is about Hilma Klint, a Swedish artist who started making artworks around 1906. And I was quite interested in how she's called a pioneer of abstraction, because people kind of champion her these days about how she's one of the first abstract artists. But they also talk about how our artworks look like diagrams. And so in my essay, I'm looking about how these two concepts relate. Are they contradictory or do they go together? So basically about how diagrams are abstractions, and how her works are diagrams, but they're also cryptic, and how she's using diagrams to work through her ideas about her spirituality. But in this talk, I'm going to talk about my other essay, which is about intersections between art, diagrams, time, and technology. So in this chapter, I'm talking about how artists use diagrams to visualize time and to visualize different conceptions of time. So, and how these artworks are mainly related to how we envision technology, our relationships to technological change. The cultural historian Charlie Geer writes about a need for artists to explore changing relationships with time in the era when the evolution of technology is accelerating and causing a mixture of anxiety and euphoria. So in my chapter, I discuss 3 examples in different media. One is in print, this is this example. One is in drawing, and one is in moving image. And so one of the artworks I talk about is George Widener. So he uses calendars, diagrams of machines, drawings of cities, and he foregrounds connections between time and space. His works include predictions about the future and speculations about time travel. And another work I talk about is the work of Amy Clark, and she uses simultaneous displays of live data streams from the stock market. And she also uses images of polluting molecules. So her artwork is all about how there's connections between financial speculation, social media, and the environment. But I'm mainly going to talk about this work, which is the album cover for Unknown Pleasures. Sorry, I forgot to say that I discuss all of these 3 examples in the light of Suzanne Lieb's writing about the use of diagrams as a means of expression in 20th and 21st century art. She writes that diagrammatic artworks are a reflection of the influences of technological developments and how that has had an effect on modern subjectivity. And a theme that emerged when I wrote the chapter was the relevance of science fiction to imaginative engagements with diagrams in the age of rapid technological change. And I use the writing of the cognitive psychologist Barbara Tversky to analyze how the artworks are diagrammatic. What features in the artworks kind of look like a diagram, how they're using diagrams to create meaning. Barbara Tversky's her working definition of a diagram is, and I quote, an arrangement of marks on a virtual page, stone, paper, or screen. So there she's linking very different epochs of time. So she's indicating that diagrams go way back to the Stone Age, that represent a set of ideas and their relations. So this definition includes graphs, charts, models, visualizations, and other graphic representations. And Tversky explains that visualizations of any kind, including artworks or artifacts or maps or diagrams, are a means of externalizing thought. They reflect and affect thought, and they facilitate revision, contemplation, and communication. So this is something the previous speaker was talking about, how diagrams externalize thought. They kind of offload the brain, and they allow you to externalize thoughts onto a paper so that you can then manipulate those thoughts visually. And as previously mentioned, I'm going to talk about this diagram mainly. And in writing about this, I consider Barbara Tversky's observation that diagram makers from any discipline might aim for clarity, or they might aim for ambiguity. So I'm thinking of, say, a graphic designer, a friend of mine. She was talking about how when she presents ideas to a client, she doesn't give them anything too fixed or too neat or finished, because they might look at that and say, no, I don't like it. Meeting over. So she presents to them intentionally sketchy things so that it's more open for discussion. So Tversky says, ambiguity may encourage people to reconfigure things in the mind. Ambiguity might prompt associative leaps that lead to new discoveries or thoughts. So this is how ambiguous diagrams might be useful in prompting new ideas. So this album cover was an appropriated diagram. It was created by the radio astronomer Hal D. Croft for his thesis. So this is where the band kind of found this diagram. I think it's rumored to be Bernard Sumner, the guitarist, who found this diagram in an encyclopedia on his lunch break in the library. And it was created by Harold D. Croft Jr. for his thesis. And it charts a series of radio signals from the first pulsar discovered by the astrophysicist Jocelyn Bell Burnell. So pulsars are rotating neutron stars, which are formed when stars of a certain size catastrophically explode. The magnetic field and rotation causes them to emit radio beacons, which can then be recorded by radio telescopes. And this diagram is highly indexical in that each line is a separate graph that records the strength of the signal from the neutron star. And they've stacked it one above the other, which makes it easier for you to compare the shapes one to the other. And Tversky explains that images, or diagrams, can offer more immediate forms of communication than linguistic descriptions. She says, diagrams use marks and placement on the page to represent thought spatially. On the other hand, the relationships between words and meaning is primarily arbitrary, which can mean sometimes it might take you longer to connect meaning, to make the connection between a word and meaning. And strings of words take time to unfold over time, whereas an image is more immediate. So she says, and I quote, making sense and making inferences are often faster and more productive from well-designed diagrams than from language. She's a cognitive psychologist, so her research is into how do you most efficiently communicate meaning through diagrams. Harold D. Croft says that he made an earlier version of this diagram that he abandoned in favor of this version. In the earlier version, he experimented with the aesthetics of the image. He says, I also wrote a program that, instead of having these lines stacked up vertically, straight, I tilted them off at a slight angle so that it would look like you were looking up a hillside, which was aesthetically interesting and pleasing, but on the other hand, it just confused the whole image. So what he's saying was he created a computer program that would make that image tilt diagonally across the page, and he felt that kind of brought forth this metaphor of looking up a hillside. But in the end, he abandoned that version because he felt, because it was tilting, it makes it less easy to compare the one line with the other. So he used this vertical stack, which he felt was more or less contaminated by image manipulation and was just clearer. But I thought that was really interesting because I thought that kind of early experimentation of aesthetics and metaphor, and he was experimenting with the materials of his practice. Here, the program that he was using to create that image. And you could think about that as, like a sculptor experimenting with materials, like experimenting with clay in the studio. And I thought that's kind of like an early stage of experimentation and playfulness and playing with aesthetics that may be present in kind of the early stages of research in scientific practices that maybe sometimes get left behind when you have to publish and you have to speak to your peers in your discipline, and they're not expecting something that is less than functional, let's say. The art historian Martin Kent says, if we look at their processes rather than their end products, science and art share so many ways of proceeding: observation, structured speculation, visualization, exploitation of analogy and metaphor, experimental testing, and the presentation of a remade experience in particular styles. So to go to Peter Saville, who's a designer who designed this, so you can see the major alteration he made was that he reversed the color scheme, so it's white lines on a dark background. So obviously, he chose a dark background to reference the theme of space, deep space, and also he thought, I guess it looked more eye-catching and attractive, let's say. And he obviously, when appropriating this diagram, he's doing the obvious thing, which is you remove the title of the diagram, and you remove it from its original context, which is the encyclopedia and a PhD thesis. You're removing its original function, really. It's no longer communicating, because it doesn't have the title anymore. It's kind of hard. It's hard to read it as in its original, for its original purpose of communicating data about radio pulses. So it just becomes a lot more ambiguous, and it becomes even more ambiguous because you can see that on the front cover there isn't a title of the album, there isn't the name of the band. All that information is at the back. So that was quite mysterious. That's kind of adding to the mystery of the image. In 1973, Pink Floyd had done that when they had Dark Side of the Moon, where they didn't have the title of the band on the image. But it was still quite unusual to have a very cryptic image on the cover of the album and not have the name of the band on it. So the diagram was actually chosen by the band, I was saying. As Saville said, they recognized it as an enigmatic symbol for the record cover. And I was thinking about how, placed in a new context, a diagram encourages multiple interpretations and imaginative projections. So the visualization of radio pulses maybe also looks a bit like heartbeats on a monitor. Maybe it also looks like sound waves, which relates to its new function as the cover of the album. And he's also intentionally made it quite small. It looks quite isolated in this expanse of black space. So it gives it a sense of a bit of vulnerability, a bit of isolation there, which communicates some themes of the lyrics in the album. So the emotional and intellectual tenor of the music and the triptych nature of the lyrics in the album, which imply themes such as alienation, longing, hope, fear, shame, reality, and dreams. The artwork also connects, so it's connecting experiences of landscapes, remember the hilly metaphor, natural processes, feelings of social and personal alienation, and feelings of the sublime and faced with the immensity of space and time. Saville says, I was aware of how a single image could evoke an entire train of thought. The band member, Bernard Sumner, connected the album cover with science fiction. So this is where a theme in the chapter is science fiction and diagrams. In Joy Division, he says, I had insomnia, and I stayed up very late. I was building synthesizers. They took months to build, soldering all the components, and I'd have 2001 Space Odyssey playing on in the background. If you take the obelisk out of that movie, it has the same black shape. So he's connecting this image with the obelisk in Space Odyssey. In Space Odyssey, a mysterious monolithic entity like a pulsar also transmits signals through space. So the monolith is kind of transmitting a signal to the rest of humanity about the existence of humanity. Maybe that's one interpretation. Stanley Kubrick called the monolith a kind of cosmic burglar alarm created by an ancient and highly advanced extraterrestrials who search for other beings. So you can see this kind of bringing back this theme of the obelisk transmitting signals through deep space, the pulses coming from neutron stars being collected by telescopes, transmission of sound waves across a room when you put a speaker on, and music. So to kind of wrap it up, so visual cultures from scientific research and new technology such as radio telescopes have informed art and popular culture, and these diagrams have become powerful associative images, so they kind of get loosened up from their original function, onto which personal and social narratives can be about a place in the universe can be projected. There's a lot about projecting meanings. And the diagram connects notions of deep time, of geological timescales, or musical signatures, or personal narratives. And as Suzanne Lieb says, diagrams in 20th and 21st century artwork signal a modern subjectivity in which body and technology, desire and scientific rationality interact together. Okay, so hold theme. So please.
Is it possible to get the... Yeah, maybe. Is that right? Yeah.
If you were thinking of going to see the football, England have qualified and the team haven't turned up. They've all gone down the pub, so there's no point. Sorry, bad joke. Some of you thought it was real.
I'll use this. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say actually, this is slightly weird because we've never done this, and what we've done for the last, when was COVID? 4 years ago, was it? For the last 4 years or whatever, it's just stare at each other on screens and constantly interrupt each other and disagree and go down weird rabbit holes. So this is quite a formal and slightly weird actually doing this, but it's good. We'll get, anyway. Right, so so I've got two I'm going to try to whiz through these two chapters if it's possible. They're basically sort of one chapter in two parts, like one very long chapter in two parts. And they're both on Deleuze and the diagram. And Deleuze has let's say an idiosyncratic diagram concept. Certainly his concept of the diagram doesn't really match with a dictionary definition of a diagram, although I will say I want to claim that it's legitimate for Deleuze to call what he's talking about a diagram, because it's about relations or connections, and it's about abstraction. I'm going to first, the first chapter is called, they're both called Deleuze's living diagram. And the first one is from structural to intensive relations. I'll talk about that first, bracket, the biological idea. So I want to talk about this in relation to biology. I think Deleuze is someone who's very interested in science and mathematics. And what I've tried to do is go back to Difference and Repetition, which Deleuze wrote in 1968. It's his sort of major book. With sort of everything is sort of there in Difference and Repetition, and then he develops it in different ways in different books. But he first got the diagram concept later in the sort of mid-70s. He took it from Foucault, from Discipline and Punish, where Foucault talks about the panopticon as not a blueprint of a prison, but as a disciplinary diagram. Later in his book, Deleuze will go on to talk about how really that diagram describes it's a system of containing masses of people. So it doesn't have to be a prison. It could be a school. It could be a factory. It could be barracks or whatever. And that's done through buildings, the physical materials, bricks and so on, and it's done through language as well. It's done through discourse. And thinking about the analogy idea, and one way to put it is you could say bricks are to buildings as words are to statements. But for Deleuze, that's not correct, because there's what he calls a mushy mixture. There's always a mushy mixture of words and bricks going on and combining in different ways, influenced by the contingent sort of environmental situation. Now, in difference and repetition, Deleuze is trying to get away from the standard way that we think about difference and identity. We think about difference, according to him, in terms of identity, in terms of opposition, in terms of resemblance, and in terms of analogy. So he's dead against analogy, and he's dead against all of those ways of thinking about difference, because he thinks that is a form of what he calls sedentary difference. It's a rare difference that doesn't show how difference has been formed in the first place. How difference is an active differentiating. So he goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle's always the bad guy. This is the or sort of my version of this famous Aristotelian branching, which brings in identity, where the species are identified according to a genus, a concept. So spirit and body are both forms of substance, for example. Spirit and body then function in terms of opposition. And we eventually end up with individuals which can't be differentiated anymore in terms of genus and species. And so there are merely perceptual differences at that point, differences within the genus human, for example. And of course, it's always coming down to the human. Now, one thing that happens is in order to make a big leap, we have to use analogy, as I was talking about before. So analogy is really criticized on the basis of Deleuze's transcendental principle of connectivity, which is univocity. Univocity is a term that he takes from Duns Scotus. So this is sort of going back to scholastic medieval philosophy, really. And it's going against St. Thomas Aquinas, who picked up on Aristotle's notions. Aristotle had this idea of equivocity. Things can be equivocal. We can use the same word to describe different things. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, those different things, in fact, have a focal meaning. So we could talk about healthy food or healthy complexion. We're using the word healthy in different ways, but they both relate to a notion of health. So they are sort of commonly linked. But if we talk about, that was a good pizza, or, whatever, God is good, then you're talking about things which are not relatable in some way. So this is how the scholastic debates sort of took Aristotle and tried to formulate them or sort of wrestle with them in terms of Christianity and what that might mean. So it really comes down to a question of being. And for Aristotle, being is not something that can be a genus, because things all have being. So you can't have a species of being which has a genus of being. That would be a contradiction. So everything is in its own way, but there's a sort of hierarchy at that point. Now, what Deleuze is wanting to say, this is his basic sort of ontology of univocity, is that no, everything is being, everything is on this same plane, but this being is different it differentiates differently, and being is differentiation. And what he wants to look at is how difference is not presented in its finished form, where we can say, well, this is a plant, this is an animal, this is a sedentary sort of form of difference, where everything's sort of already there. He wants to talk about what he calls a sort of genetic form of difference, where how does this difference come about in the first place? So this is why you have to talk about difference in terms of an active differentiation, difference making itself. So there's always a becoming in this sense. This is a more sort of nomadic rather than sedentary notion. And he relates these two things to the difference between extensive qualities and intensive quantity. So we have this notion of intensity with Deleuze. Difference is always about movement, it's about kinetics, it's about intensities, it's about forces, it's about speeds, accelerations. And I'm going to talk about a little bit like this in terms of the biological idea. So on the right, I have a sort of notion of a sort of diagram, an iconic diagram. Deleuze's diagrams are not iconic. Deleuze's diagram, and I see the proto-diagram already operating in difference and repetition, but it's really what he later goes on to talk about in terms of the abstract machine. So there's virtual elements which are abstract. What he means by abstract is that they are independent of form and function. So we're talking about a principle of connectedness, which univocity allows because everything is connected in some way. And it's simply these dynamics. I say simply, it's a very, very complicated processes, and you'll never get to the bottom of it. But this is where the diagram is operating, okay? So the diagram is not something which is laid out. It's not a question of intelligible relations. It's a question of intensive relations. I'm going to try to explain this in terms of biology and the biological idea. So one way Deleuze talks about this is in terms of one of his sort of heroes, early 19th century biologist, anatomist called Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, who we will call Geoffroy for simplicity. It's easier. Deleuze is comparing Geoffroy to Cuvier. And Cuvier is this great sort of comparative anatomist. All these people had already, this is pre-Darwin, but they already had they already believed that there was some form of evolution, that we have evolved from other species. So this is already a sort of modern breakthrough. Everything wasn't created at the beginning by God or whatever, and they're forever like this. But still, for Cuvier, there are major, what he calls embranchments. So this goes back to the sort of arboreal schema of Aristotle and the idea of branches. These things can never have connected, can never be connected, mostly because of the way that they function in their environments. So a mollusk is fundamentally disconnected from a vertebrate, for example. Now, Geoffroy did not believe this, and Geoffroy had this idea of these elements, these sort of virtual elements. I mean, he's mostly still talking on a level of sort of skeletal structures and so on. But as you can see from one of his drawings here, he can sort of see the way a tail could potentially grow on a human. And what is going on for the diagram or this proto-diagram for Deleuze when he talks about those correspondences without resemblance is that really what the relations, the sort of relations, which are not intelligible relations, but they are intensive differential relations between these different points. So there's this sort of soup of things, intensive things happening, and this occurrence is what determines or what actualizes something, and that's the thing which then is taken up by people and put in sort of these classificatory jars, these the sort of classificatory structures and classes and categories of things. So it's this level of sort of intense becomings where there's these elements, they are sort of connecting with other elements, and then something emerges from that, something actualizes, an individuation occurs. So he's interested in that moment. You can see it very strongly in embryology, in what Deleuze would call the larval subject, this sort of unimaginable sort of existence when we're sort of bent and pulled and twisted and folded by these forces that would just break our spines at the point where we have spines. So this is what he's interested in. Now, the example I give in the chapter is to do with genetics and how I might illustrate this point through genetics. So there are particular genes called homeobox genes, and these homeobox genes don't immediately sort of express characteristics through proteins and so on, but they actually switch on a whole bunch of other genes. And the timing is absolutely crucial. So the timing will determine when these other genes get switched on. If there's something wrong with the timing, it will miss the point, and there'll be some sort of deformation in the embryo. Different timings will generate different parts of the body as well. So the way our hands develop, and it's not just our hands, but it's also like the feet of birds or various other sort of species, is dependent on speeds. So the fastest speed generates little finger, and that comes first. And then it gets slower all the way down as the other ones are generated. So these are the sort of intensive differential relations that Deleuze is really interested in. So there's a diagram going on here between these. The way that there's a correspondence between these intensive processes and then what comes out of it. Something comes out, is hatched out of the egg, born, but there's no resemblance to what came before. So we can't think of a gene as a blueprint, just as we can't think of the disciplinary diagram as a sort of blueprint of an architectural structure. But of course, this process never ends. It continues. There's reciprocal determination. There's a sort of feedback. New things are happening. There's always a process. There's a sort of diagram that wants to fix things and compare them, like the Aristotelian system. It wants to fix things and say, okay, now we see that this is similar to this is opposite to this. These can both be identified in terms of a higher sort of category. And if none of that works, we'll form an analogy. Well, at least A is to B, as C is to D. Okay? So he wants to get away from all that through this notion of univocity. Now, what they did to this poor fruit fly is they found this homeobox gene called eyeless eye. They've all got great names, these things. And that eyeless eye triggers 2,000 genes that generates the cells of a fly's eye. Now, if they inject it into other parts of the body, what they call them imaginal discs, where other things should form, where the antennae is supposed to form, then instead of an antennae, you'll get an eye, or you'll get an eye on the end of an antennae, and so on. Now, even more weird and wonderful, they found that the same homeobox gene that forms eyes in mammals could be injected into a fruit fly, and it would still grow these eyes. It would grow fruit fly eyes. They did it with mouse eyes, or the mouse homeobox gene. Injected it all over this poor fruit fly, or many poor fruit flies, and it grew eyes. They are not mouse eyes; they are fruit fly eyes, but they can see. Apparently, they can see, according to tests they did with sort of electrical conductivity to the neurons and so on. I don't know if I quite believe that, but apparently they can see. But of course, what this relates to is what Deleuze would describe as this univocity, or this univocal plane, or this common plane of being, whereby on a genetic level we're very, very close to the fruit fly. I'm sure you could do the experiment the other way around, but they haven't done that yet. Or maybe someone has and they haven't told anyone. Okay, have I been talking for too long? Shall I stop?
Done 15.
I've got 15 minutes. Okay, I should probably stop then.
Let me quickly explain your Bacon diagram.
Okay, I'll quickly explain the Bacon diagram. So what's interesting to me about his book on Bacon is that suddenly, after rejecting analogy, Deleuze suddenly comes up with this concept of analogy, which he calls a static analogy, or I'm calling nervous analogy. Now, Bacon actually uses the term diagram or graph. He actually uses the term graph. And for Bacon, the graph, or for Bacon Deleuze, the graph or the diagram is a trap. It's a way to trap something alive. And what you trap with a diagram through paint is again set sensation, force, pressure, nervous, the sort of nervousness of life, affect. That's what he's after. So this is the resemblance by non-resembling means. And the way the correlation works is that there's an aliveness, or a sort of liveness, or a sort of autonomy, a plastic quality to paint itself. And therefore there's an analogy, but it's not a structural analogy. It's a nervous or a static analogy with the intensities that you feel on your own body. And Bacon is painting bodies. Analogical language on the left. This is the kinesic way in which animals communicate. Animals don't communicate about objects and concepts. They communicate about relations. Everything's about relations. And in fact, that's mostly how we communicate as well. Underneath the surface of this sort of understanding and reason and concepts and symbolic language, we're constantly checking out each other's body language, facial expressions, tone of voice. Those are the things that give us a weird feeling, you know, sort of put us on alert. Deleuze also talks about analog synthesizers. Now, an analog synthesizer is a continuously variable mold, and he relates that because the analog synthesizer operates on a continuous plane, unlike the digital. So again, there's no separation. It's a question of univocity. He relates that to color in particular, because color is the way that you modulate paint. So there's these three elements: the fields, the figure, and the contour. And I'm just imagining them as little knobs on a sort of analog synth. These are the three elements of a Bacon painting. And this is my sort of iconic diagram of Bacon's diagram here, which is describing these intensive forces. You know, this is some guy basically puking up or retching into a sink. Very odd, you know, I'm sure we've all experienced it at some point or another. And it's the way that these pressures on the body cause the body to fold up, cause these intensities, we're sort of disorganized in some way. The body sort of changes shape. And there's these questions in the painting and through the color of these contractions, these expansions, this sort of rhythm. He calls it a sort of diastolic, systolic rhythm, like the heart pumping, all these other organs that's happening through the way that the paint is functioning through these three different elements. I was going to say one more thing. Yes, the resemblance, because it's a non-resembling resemblance, and we've talked a little bit about indexes tonight. He's not talking about the index, because that would be a normal one way of talking about the analog as an index, as opposed to an icon. But he's talking about neither icons nor indexes, because the index is passive. The index is always going to be similar. So to talk about photography, it is a passive perception of light. And he's not trying to capture a figure in that way. He's trying to capture a figure, the intensity, the sensation of light. And the only way you can do that is to form this nervous analog with the nature, the liquid, the plastic, the intensive plasticity of paint, the liquid quality of paint, the fact that it's got a sort of autonomous life, does things, it takes you in other directions, and the color. And I haven't even really talked about the Bacon's diagram, but I think I've spoken enough, so pass over to David.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to probably cut out some things, but so I'm going to try and do it a bit off the cuff. So I've written 2 chapters. One of them is there such a thing as an audio or sonic diagram? I'm not going to talk about that, but there is. So you have to read the book. The second chapter is about artists and physicists and their diagramming. And I have an interest in physics, but I really can't say I totally understand it. But I'm very interested in the counterintuitive world of physics, and in particular how other artists are interested in the quantum. It seems there's something going on from like scholars and artists interested in blackness, like Denise De Silva, or black quantum futurism, who I'm going to mention at the end, or people like Johnny Golding, some of you might know, interested in entanglement, Sarancino, the artist making installations, loads of people, Karen Barrard, who's like, so I sort of think, okay, theoretically, that's really interesting. What if I live my life like that? Is it possible? And do scientists live like that? So during the lockdown time, a lot of my time was either spent on the screen, like many of us, or outside walking around. And at night, I would walk around because it was safest, because everywhere was like an assassin. Didn't want to touch it. And I began to learn the names of stars and enjoyed seeing the planets. And I decided that my favourite star was Betelgeuse. Now, Betelgeuse is red, slightly rouge, and it was fading. And then it was in the news because it wasn't dying. People were looking out for this explosion. It wasn't dying. It was that there was a cloud, a dust cloud, passing in front of it. I'm not proud of this drawing. And I have to say, most of the drawings that I'm going to show you are done in these meetings. My colleagues probably don't know I'm doing the drawings, but they do the job for me. And most of my writing is done on the tube, by the way. But that's the same for most academics, I believe. But this diagram was, I was just trying to think like about what I'd read by this physicist, Carlos Rovelli, whom probably a lot of you know. And Rovelli says, humans perceive entropy as a flow of absolute time. There's no absolute time. It's an illusion of the senses. The brain produces time. The brain is a time machine. I think he's quoting someone there. Humans live in the bubble of now. So the present and even time for some physicists is a complete illusion or at least in the way that we experience it. I'm really interested in whether it's possible to overcome my brain. I don't know whether scientists live like this, but what would it mean? And I think there are cultural, moral, political, and social aspects to thinking about that as an artist. And I got very interested in the artists that had done that. There is a very famous physicist called John Wheeler. John Wheeler is associated with the black hole. People think that he coined the term, but it wasn't. It was a journalist, a woman who I don't know her name, probably coined it. But he's very interesting, and he said, I have a feeling, this is John Wheeler, I have a feeling that an idea is not a good idea unless it lends itself to be stated in a nice, compelling picture. I would be happy if the whole of physics could be expressed in the form of simple, attractive diagrams, which he said in 1994, which was very much at the end of his career. And this is a famous John Wheeler diagram, some of you might know. It's the universe becoming conscious of itself. So it starts on the right-hand side and expands from the Big Bang, and at some point there's humans, and the humans become conscious of the universe. That's the universe becoming conscious of themselves. However, for me, and I don't think this is true of all science, but for obvious reasons, even though there's an I, the body and embodiment is missing. And that's precisely what I found in artists who were very much affected by physics. So I'm just going to go through, I've got some stuff about Yacoob, who's a very important person who writes about cosmotechnics, and some Simondon stuff for Simondon fans. I'm afraid I'm not going to comment on that. I'm just going to go through some of the images and tell you why I like them. So this is a mobile by Alexandra Calder, sort of dismissed as childish stuff. But Calder was someone very early on influenced by, I guess, post-Newtonian physics. And there was something called the Dimensionist Manifesto, which was signed by many artists, including Alexandra Calder, which was produced by this artist called Charles Serato, who just said to art that now is the time, and this was in the 1930s, now is the time for artists to address non-Euclidean space. And I think Calder is one of the people who does that. It's sort of simple stuff, but what interests me reading about Calder, and this is my diagram. Obviously, I cut and pasted some things in afterwards, but that was done in a particularly boring, sorry, I know I've got a colleague here, particularly boring teaching committee. So someone called Vanya Malloy, a scholar on Calder, notes how Calder, who was a reader of Einstein, and sight, seeing an Uri is a very formative experience, one of those models of the universe, notes that he called his mobiles universes, which apparently Duchamp is meant to have provided that name, and tells a story that Calder tells about being on a ship and seeing the sun and the moon in the sky and setting at the same time, and understanding at that point where they were, in the universe, some sort of mind-blowing bursting of the bubble of what the present was. And I think that, I won't say too much, but what Malloy says is that there is a phenomenological approach to presenting this system, if you like, which is completely, beyond really human understanding as a in its totality, like gravity, etc. So I'm interested really in when artists take physics and perhaps the diagrams and terms of physics and then put them through a phenomenological or even thinking about the senses of a process in which the body becomes in that diagram. Not because it's better than science, but just because I think then the bubble of the present bursts. An artist that I like very much, Yaya Kusama. Probably everybody knows polka dots. But I think a lot has not been written about, or there could be more attention paid to how Kusama, who more recently has obviously been interested in the quantum, but very early on thought about the polka dot as the sun, the earth, the moon, atomic particles, and the human. And she wrote this book called Manhattan Suicide, in which the key protagonist says, there are 10 billion bubbles inside my body, which is precisely why I feel at one with 10 billion stars that twinkle in the heavens, and why I talk to the clouds made up of 10 billion teeny drops of water, and why I hear the voice of the wind carrying 10 billion atoms. So I think maybe if you know Kusama's work and history, she talks about being a high priestess of oblivion, and you got polka dot on your body, polka dot in the space, everything's polka dot. There are no longer any borders, or everything is in like fluid motion, a bit like Dean's diagram, I would say, of Bacon. And I'm really disorientated when I go into those rooms. And I think that there's some kind of analogy maybe to quantum foam. But also I think there is a sort of cosmic relation that Kusama makes, one in which the ego is kind of on the verge of dissolving, because in those spaces, and that's my diagram of it. Again, not a drawing I'm proud of, but there's a constant sense of not knowing whether you're one of the reflections or how big you are and where you are, and also sense of scale and distance completely is very difficult to ascertain. The next person, I think I'm just going to skip, but very interesting, John Latham, was an artist who absolutely believed that if humans understood more about time being fundamental to the universe and the illusion of the present, we might solve a lot of our political problems, environmental problems, way back in the 70s. But I'll just finish with this. So maybe I will say about something about Yacoob. So Yacoob has written a lot about what he terms cosmotechnics, and he's very much against this Promethean idea, a kind of European Western idea that science and technology, a gift from the gods, makes humans behave like gods, and therefore we become divided or separated from reality or nature. And what he's interested in is that in other parts of the world and in other traditions, there are different kinds of ontologies, different ideas about being and reality. And he writes a lot about China in his books. Probably some of you know about it. And it's this idea that, or this question, is it possible to address moral and cosmic orders through, and I would say, aesthetic, technical practices? And I think it's in diagrams and the diagrammatic that it is possible and that it does happen. And so I talked a little bit about, the current interest in the quantum and a collaborative art practice that is really, I think, doing very interesting political work is Black Quantum Futurism. It's a collaboration, a duo, and this is an image from the ICA show. And I think that, well, firstly, just to say what they do, or some of the things that they've done, they have this sort of joke, but it's also very interesting. This idea of if you think of the grandfather paradox, which is you cannot go back in time, because if you could, you'd kill your grandfather, and therefore you could not go back in time. They see that as a very sort of European, Western idea, that you don't find that in African mythology, that kind of linear idea. You can, there are multiple possibilities for traveling timelines. So they call that the grandmother paradox. And they call upon Hugh Everett, who is a physicist, probably famous, that you might know, for coming up with this idea of the multiverse. This idea that as the universe, following the Big Bang, expands, there are multiple universes created every time that there's an event. There's multiple possibilities, and they occur. So they fictionally grab that, and one of the diagram on the right is what they use in workshops to get people to think about history. So they're addressing quite a lot the black experience in America, where they're from, and the Atlantic slave trade, which erases certain histories, which means that you can't go back in time. But through Hugh Everett's multiverse idea, maybe there's a fiction that allows you to do that, and therefore you can create these different ideas about what history might have been and what the future might be. And I think that there's at the moment, what I'd say, that there is this interest in the quantum and diagrammatic approaches which are being used to overcome the limits of thinking about the political and the social in the arts and humanities, thinking about the limits of Newtonian cause and effect universes, which most of us inhabit, which quite a lot of us don't really think about because it's difficult. So that's the end. Thank you. So I really thank you for staying with us. I hope there was a lot there. I would like to invite anyone who has a diagram that they'd like to show us, or any comment or feedback, or any question. You might all think, okay, now's time to go, but if you want to go, please go. Don't feel you have to stay. But if you do have anything, share it with us. And if you've done a diagram or a drawing, we'd really love to have it. Even if it says, even if it says that. Is there anybody who's got anything to say or any corrections? Claire, you look like you're going to say something. You have to wait. Sorry, speak. Sorry. Go back there. Pass this back. David, John, hold up. Oh.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I've almost got too much going on in my head to really say anything coherent, but thanks very much for bringing together all those different strands, which obviously are going to be in the book. I suppose I've been thinking about the diagram since our conversations, and it's interesting that, Dave, you might say that the diagram is the means that we might bring all these things together. I've been thinking about alchemy in relation to the diagram and the idea of quantum alchemy. So I think there's a very, very long tradition of alternative thinking, if you like, and thought forms. And something that's emerged in my research was that Newton, in fact, was an alchemist. So it's one way that we might reassess, let's say, some of the knowledge that we already have that has been siloed, as Dean is suggesting. I think that's probably all I should say at this point. But obviously the conversation's ongoing. Thank you.
He's waiting for the mic. He's always staying on.
have you thought of, for each of your chapters, do a diagram of how it works, how it develops, and how it actually maps your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, we could do it after this.
Yeah, strangely enough, I'm not sure it works, but it is like a good question, because the actual question could be like, why not just show us a diagram? And maybe that's because what we're trying to do is to an extent discursive and pedagogic, and I think diagrams are. We're not massive fans of diagrams just in books, really. We like to actually diagram live. This is why this is a bit weird for us. We first started, like Dean, me and John, after the occupations and the protests about austerity in 2011, and we gathered together and we thought, oh, diagrams are a way of us understanding what's going on and what we should do. But we got nowhere, obviously, with the protests against austerity. So you blame us for the 14 years that's just happened. But we found the diagramming really inspiring, particularly with teachers, and it helped us understand things. And maybe this situation is a bit weird, because what we should have done is like a mass diagram. But I think one diagram wouldn't do it. You'd have to have a series, but maybe we should try it and get you all back and see. I don't know. Do you want to say anything?
Well, we have. I think your diagrams are wonderful, David. I don't know why you're so embarrassed about them. Well,
liberal nets, AI. It's tough, but you see it's close. Quite magnificent.
I mean, on Claire's point, I mean, I think I sort of got into diagrams through not through alchemy, but through alchemical diagrams, and obviously analogy, the sort of shoveling it on, the analogy after analogy after analogy, which makes those things such sort of they're sort of labyrinthine. You really go into them. Something I appreciate about diagrams is they are sort of a form of reading, in the sense that you cannot just glance at them. Or let's say they're not the kind of diagrams I'm interested in. I'm interested in the ones that you need to spend time sort of delving into. But also with the alchemical diagrams, you get the relation between analogy and allegory, which is another thing. That also is true of the large glass as a relation between analogy. In a way, allegory is a sort of extended analogy where you just keep going. It's a bit like Plato's cave or something. You have the basic up, down, darkness, light, all those sort of things which are sort of cliches to us, but still are so embedded in our language. But you just extend it into a story with these characters and so on. So that's what I really appreciate about alchemical diagrams, which somehow exist outside of the sort of canon of like Western art. You tend not to find them in books of like history of art, except for that Dura Melancholia, which somehow crosses that divide. But I find them fascinating precisely because they're not that sort of instantaneous thing that often is a way that you sort of move around a gallery from painting to painting. They're usually, diagrams are normally not best seen in a gallery, to be honest. They're normally much better seen in a book, for my sort of liking anyway. on the floor, on the ceiling.
You're pretty that.
John Cussans does diagrams on the floor. He does his Veve diagrams and then dances over them and destroys them.
Can I say? Yeah. I did a lot of diagrams actually. I have 5 pages of diagrams because I like taking notes. But I think ending on the quantum is fantastic because I think it all comes to that actually, an expanded consciousness of the universe and breaking the boundaries between our, individual selves and, thinking about things in a more holistic way. But it also reminded me of other techniques that maybe they're not traditionally seen as diagrams. And I'm thinking about Brecht, for example. There's a wonderful exhibition now at the Raven Road Gallery where they're showing Brecht's collage. And that's an interesting form of diagrammatic thinking about politics and the critique. And also, the challenge to the alienation, the whole alienation aspect, right? To do it through fragmentation. And I think the diagram has this fragmentary aesthetics as well, right? So all these are fragments that are organized. It's just a thought I hadn't seen.
One of the things I was really interested in all the presentations was the what I heard as a kind of imperative towards transformation in a lot of the diagrams. And this question comes a little bit from talking with you, Mary, about the dialogues that you're having with one another. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about diagrams and dialogues and maybe the kind of transformative imperative behind each, particularly in light of the fact that this came from your dialogues. Thanks.
So in a sense, diagrams are abstractions of ideas. They're abstract representations of ideas or objects, and that kind of abstraction can leave them open to lots of different interpretations. So, for example, so in my PhD, I'm doing a project about making diagrammatic artworks in response to conversations I'm having with scientists. So I'm working with a biologist and a physicist and architect. And the interesting thing was I made a diagrammatic artwork in response to diagrams of sound insulation. So it's going to imagine a kind of big blue piece of paper with lots of wavy lines going across the paper. And a physicist saw it, and it reminded him of magnetic fields because that's what his area of research is. So I redid that diagram so that it was more in keeping with his research, because the problem with my diagram was that I stopped and started the wavy lines in between these posts because it made it easier for me to draw a wavy line across a meter of paper if I stopped and started the wavy lines in between these posts. But for him, those are kind of a magnetic field. You wouldn't have those kind of stop and start. The line would have to be continuous across the page. So I redid the drawing so that it was more in keeping with his research. And then I thought he came up with the idea that it was quite interesting because my original drawing was about sound waves, but he's talking about magnetic fields, and you get these kind of similar visual images of kind of these contour lines moving across the page. And so it's a kind of transformative thing, is that one kind of visual system appropriate for one area of life is transformed into something that's appropriate for another area of life. And there's another project I'm doing with an architect where I do an abstracted drawing from an architectural plan, and then she translated it back into these models that we then translated into a big structure that we then diagrammed and then made some other stuff. So it was this kind of generative process, the diagram being as a machine, as kind of abstract machine, as Deleuze would put it, kind of going from one stage to another, generating one idea.